Happy New Year. You know, I was not supposed to be in the pulpit this Sunday, but plans change, people get sick, and I find myself with you on the first Sunday of a new year and a new decade. And it's good to be with you. It's good to be with you even though the news at the opening of this new year, and what will perhaps be the most important decade in human history, is bitter and harsh. It's good to be with you precisely when the news of the world is bitter and harsh, and that's when we need religious community the most. The assassination of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani by a United States military drone strike on sovereign Iraqi soil has pushed the Middle East into crisis. Soleimani was killed alongside an Iraqi military leader whose political party controls almost 50 seats in the Iraqi parliament and will surely plunge that government into its own crisis. These illegal acts of war violate both international law and the Congressional War Powers Act. They may lead the United States to war with Iran. They have already led to the further destabilization of the region. Hundreds of people will almost certainly be killed because of the decision of the President of the United States to authorize Soleimani's illegal political assassination. Thousands, or tens of thousands, or possibly even hundreds of thousands of people will die horribly violent deaths if this country goes to war with Iran. And I cannot help but wonder, with all that gravity, about the timing of the president's decision to have Soleimani killed. He'll soon be on trial in the Senate. The House has passed 2 articles of impeachment, and he could theoretically be removed from office. Of course, there's every sign that his allies in the Senate will prevent witnesses from being called or from a serious trial from taking place. The Senate Majority Leader even claims that he is coordinating the trial with the White House in order to facilitate a speedy acquittal. The position of the president's senatorial allies is clearly concerning. In his year-end report, Chief Justice Roberts warned, "We have come to take democracy for granted." Roberts will oversee the trial in the Senate. It appears that the Senate Majority Leader's position has him worried about his own ability to do, in his words, our best to maintain the public's trust that we are faithfully discharging our solemn obligation to equal justice under the law. Drawing the United States military into a conflict abroad will almost certainly make it more difficult to have an honest debate and trial on the President of the United States and the House's articles of impeachment. There will be calls for national unity. For many, the president will be transformed into a unifying head of state. It will be harder to criticize him. War dissenters and pacifists will be castigated for being unpatriotic. There might even be calls to delay the president's trial. This country's liberal democracy may edge closer to crisis. Over 100 years ago, the writer Randolph Bourne warned, as the United States entered World War I, that war is the health of the state. He wrote, "The moment war is declared, the mass of people, through some spiritual alchemy, with the exception of a few malcontents, proceed to allow themselves to be regimented, coerced, deranged in all the environments of their lives, and turned into a solid manufactory of destruction toward whatever other people may have, in the appointed scheme of things, come within the range of the government's disapprobation. The citizen throws off his contempt and indifference to government, identifies himself with its purposes, and revives all his military memories and symbols. Patriotism becomes the dominant feeling, and produces immediately that intense and hopeless confusion between the relation which the individual bears and should bear toward the society which he is a part. When war is the health of the state, it is challenging to be a critic of either the president or the actions he directs the military to take. It's no wonder then that the current president is not the only one to authorize dramatic, violent action during the impeachment process. President Clinton did the same thing in December of 1998 when he launched airstrikes in Iraq as the House stood poised to impeach him. Over 100 years ago, the Unitarian minister, pacifist, and first friend of Mahatma Gandhi in the United States, John Haynes Holmes, stood before his congregation in New York and told them, in the idiom of early 20th century Unitarianism, "War is an open and utter violation of Christianity. If war is right, then Christianity is false, wrong, a lie. If Christianity is right, then war is false, wrong, a lie." Today, I believe the same thing can be said in 21st century words. Unitarian Universalism upholds the inherent worth and dignity of all people, not some people, not only citizens and residents of the United States, all people, American citizens, Iranians, undocumented immigrants, everyone. Speaking only for myself, I can rephrase Holmes's words. War with Iran is an open violation of Unitarian Universalist values. If such a war is right, then Unitarian Universalism is wrong. If Unitarian Universalism is right, then such a war is wrong. You may have other views. We affirm the right of conscience and the search for truth as central to our tradition. These views are mine, and they mean that I will never pray nor preach for victory through arms or pretend that the people of Iran are any less human, any less worthy of my love or the love of the divine than any of you. And so this morning I feel myself gravely concerned for the future of this country and this world. I find myself gravely concerned because not only do the president's military actions represent a political crisis and a crisis for democracy, they are a distraction from what must be the central focus of this decade, addressing the climate emergency. The next 10 years or so will determine whether or not humanity chooses to address the climate emergency. What we do now will impact the lives of our children, the lives of our grandchildren, and if there are human beings thousands of years from now, it will impact the lives of humans yet to be born for as long as there is humanity. At such a moment in human history, I find myself reflecting upon the words of James Baldwin in the closing passage of his magnificent essay, The Fire Next Time. Baldwin's essay was written during the Civil Rights Movement, that movement to overturn Jim Crow and defeat white supremacy, which so many of us lift up and some of us participated in. Baldwin saw that movement for racial justice as something that would determine the future of the country, whether it would be a liberal democracy or a white supremacist apartheid state. Baldwin wrote, "And here we are, at the center of the arc, trapped in the gaudiest, most valuable, and most improbable water wheel the world has ever seen. Everything now, we must assume, is in our hands. And if we, and now I mean the relatively conscious whites and the relatively conscious blacks, who must, like lovers, insist on or create the consciousness of others, do not falter in our duty now, we may be able to, handful that we are, end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. If we do not dare everything, the fulfillment of that prophecy, recreated from the Bible in the song of a slave, is upon us. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. no more water, the fire next time. We are on the precipice of the fire next time. We are on the precipice because we as a country have been unable to overcome white supremacy. The current president is a white supremacist populist, and many of his supporters have made it clear that their highest loyalty is to the maintenance of a racial order and not liberal democracy. We are on the precipice of the fire next time, literally and figuratively. Literally, while the world is distracted by war, Australia is burning. Figuratively, the racial conflagration that has raged since Europeans arrived on the shores of this continent is again threatening to consume the country. The fire next time. In worship, we've been focusing on the spiritual and religious tools that are necessary to live through such an era of crisis. Today, and for the month of January, we will be focusing on what I believe is one of the most central of these tools, the cultivation of friendships. The great philosopher and critic of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, saw it clearly and observed that the cultivation of friendships are a crucial tool for those who would survive the brutalities of totalitarianism. The creation and sustenance of friendship in such times is a sign, in her words, that a bit of humanness in a world become unhuman has been achieved. And in such hours of crisis as the ones we face now, maintaining our own humanness and recognizing it in others is one of the most crucial tasks. It's difficult to kill others who we recognize as humans. Killing, especially on a mass scale, requires the abstraction of a human being into a categorical other. The human being who is a friend, a parent, a lover, a child, a sibling, or a neighbor becomes the Jew, the migrant, the black person, the indigenous person, the queer person, the transgender, the day laborer, or the Iranian. And so now let us turn to friendship for a while and consider the alchemical power it provides to make us human to each other when war has become the health of the state. Let us think about the image of the elderly Emerson resting in a dusty sunlight on an overstuffed armchair, asking his wife, "What was the name of my best friend?" Such words suggest that Thoreau's name faded long before the feelings his memory evoked. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are not exactly the type of people I usually think of when I think of friends. Thoreau, the archetypal nonconformist, sought to live in the woods by Walden Pond to prove his independence. His classic text opens, "I lived alone in the woods a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 months and 2 years. At present, I am a sojourner in civil life again." For Thoreau, solitary life was permanent, while life amongst his human fellows was but a sojourn, a temporary condition. And yet, this principled advocate of individual conscience and the right to civil disobedience needed his friends and his fellows. Despite that, Emerson was equally skeptical about the social dimensions of human nature. In his essay, Self-Reliance, he claimed, "Society everywhere is a conspiracy against every one of its members." He believed that self-discovery, awakening knowledge of the self, was primarily a task for the individual, not the community. When he was invited to join the utopian experiment Brook Farm, Emerson responded that he was unwilling to give the community the task of emancipation which I ought to take on myself. Yet both of these men sought out the company of others. Emerson gathered around him a circle of poets, preachers, and writers and intellectuals whose friendships have become legendary. and whose friendships provided them the necessary religious and spiritual resources to struggle through the abolition of slavery, to struggle for the liberation of women when such ideas laid far beyond the margins of acceptable thought. That circle contained many of our Unitarian Universalist saints. I speak of the transcendentalists Emerson and Thoreau, of course, but also the pioneering feminists Margaret Fuller and Elizabeth Peabody, the fiery abolitionist Theodore Parker, and the utopian visionary George Ripley. What we see when we look closely at Emerson and Thoreau is not two staunch individualists, but rather two men caught in the tension between community and individuality, very conscious that one cannot exist without the other. Emerson wrote on friendship and in an essay declared, "I do not wish to treat friendships daintily, but with the roughest courage. When they are real, they are the solidest things that we know, not threads or frostwork." Margaret Fuller drowned at the age of 40. Her tragic death prompted Emerson to write, "I have lost my audience." Emerson thought that Fuller was the one person who understood his philosophy most completely, even if they sometimes violently disagreed. Of her he wrote, "More variously gifted, wise, sportive, eloquent, magnificent, prophetic, reading my life at her will, and puzzling me with riddles." Of him she wrote, "That from him I first learned what is meant by the inward life, that the mind is its own place was a dead phrase to me, till he cast light upon my mind." Perhaps Fuller's early death is why Emerson recalled Thoreau and not her in the fading moments of his life. But no matter. A close study of their circle reveals an essential truth. We require others to become ourselves. The tension between the individual and the community apparent in the writings of our transcendentalists leads to contradictory statements. Emerson himself placed little stock in consistency, penning words that I sometimes take as my own slogan. "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." Let us consider Emerson the friend rather than Emerson the individualist this morning, if for no other reason that when Emerson was falling into his final solitude, he tried to steady himself with the memory of his great friend Thoreau. Emerson himself wrote, "Friendship demands a religious treatment." Have you ever had a good friend? A great friend? Can you recall what it felt to be like in that person's presence? Perhaps your friend is in the sanctuary this morning. Maybe you're sitting next to them, aware of the warmth of their body. Maybe they're distant, hacking corn stalks in rural Mexico with a machete, sipping coffee in a Paris cafe, caking paint on a fresh stretched canvas, or hustling through the cold, mazing Boston streets. I invite you to invoke the presence of your friend. Give yourself over to the quiet joy you feel when you are together. Friendship is an experience of connection. Friends remind us that we are not alone in the universe. We may be alone in the moment. We may feel alone in times of crisis, whether they are personal or societal. We may even feel isolated or seek solace in solitude. But we are always members of what William Ellery Channing called the great family of all souls. If we are wise, we learn this lesson through our friends. Again, Emerson, "We walk alone in the world. Friends such as we desire are dreams and fables. Such dreams and fables can become real. they can become the solidest thing we know. Seeking such relationships is one of the reasons why people join religious communities like First Houston. It took me a while after I started the parish ministry to recognize this. In my old congregation back in Cleveland, we had testimonials every Sunday. People would get up and talk about why they had joined the congregation. After the chalice was lit, someone would share why they had joined, and the stories were often similar. And for years, I was slightly disappointed with them. The service would start, the flame would rise up, and someone would begin, "I come to this congregation because I love the community." That's it? My internal dialogue would begin. You come here because of the community? You don't come seeking spiritual depth or new forms of religious practice or trying to engage with all the justice work that we do in the world. You come seeking community. Can't you get community someplace else? If all you are looking for is community, why don't you join a book club or find a sewing circle? We're a church. People are supposed to come here for more than just community. I must be a failure as a minister if all these people get out of this place is a sense of community. Eventually, I realized that community is an essential part of the religious experience. The philosopher William James may have believed religion is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude. But he was wrong. Religion is found in the moments of connection when we discover that we are part of something larger than ourselves. Life together, life in community, is a reminder of that reality. People seek out that experience in a congregation because of the isolating nature of contemporary life. A few years ago, Newsweek reported that in the previous 20 years, the number of people who had no close friends had tripled. Today, at least 1 out of every 4 people report that they have no one with whom they feel comfortable discussing an important matter. Congregations like this one offer the possibility of overcoming such a sense of isolation. When there is a crisis in the world or a crisis in our lives, a religious community like First Unitarian Universalist can be a place to discover that we are not alone in our struggles, that help and solidarity are always pregnant possibilities in the world, and that there is a place where we can come to find them. But also a place to celebrate life's passages and make meaning from those passages. Friendships require a center to blossom, and meaning-making and breaking isolation are pretty powerful common centers. The Greek philosopher Aristotle understood that friendship was rooted in mutual love. That love was not necessarily the love of the friends for each other. It was love for a common object. This understanding led him to describe 3 kinds of friendship: those of utility, those of pleasure, and those of virtue, which he called the complete friendship. Friendships of utility were the lowest, least valuable kind, and friendships of virtue were the highest kind. Erotic friendship, he felt, fell somewhere in between. Friendships of utility were easily dissolved. As soon as one friend stopped being useful to another, that friendship dissipated. It took me until I was in my 20s to really understand the transitory nature of friendships of utility. I spent a handful of years between college and seminary working as a software engineer in Silicon Valley. I worked for about a year at an online bookstore. When a recession hit, there was a round of layoffs, and as the junior member of my department, I was laid off. Up to that point, I had spent a fair amount of time with several of my colleagues socially. We would have lunch or go out to drink after work. I enjoyed the company of one colleague in particular. I made the mistake of thinking that he was really my friend. He had a master's degree in classical literature. Our water cooler conversations sometimes revolved around favorite authors from antiquity, Homer and Sappho. From his tongue flowed speech sweeter than honey, said one. Like a mountain whirlwind punishing the oak trees, love shattered my heart, said the other. Alas, when I lost my job, a common love of literature was not enough to sustain our relationship. My colleague was somehow always busy whenever I suggested we get together. Have you ever had a similar experience? Such friends come and go throughout our working lives. Far rarer are what Aristotle calls the friendships of virtue. These are the enduring friendships. They help us to become better people, and congregational life provides us opportunities to build such friendships. The virtues might be understood as those qualities that we cultivate which are praiseworthy. They are the qualities that shape a good and whole life. A partial list of Aristotle's virtues runs bravery, temperance, generosity, justice, prudence. Friendship offers us the opportunity to practice these virtues, and in doing so, helps us to become better, more religious people. The virtues require a community to practice them in. That is one reason why we have been considering the spiritual and religious tools we need in this era of crisis together, and speaking of the virtues in worship. Let's think about bravery for a moment. The brave, Aristotle believed, stand firm in face of what is frightening, not with a foolhardy arrogance, but instead knowing full well the consequences of their decisions. They face their fears because they know that by doing so they may achieve some greater good. Standing for justice is one form of bravery, but seeking a friend is another. For it always contains within it the possibility of rejection. Emerson observed, "The only reward of virtue is virtue. The only way to be a friend, or to have a friend, is to be one." I've often found when I hoped for friends that I needed to initiate the relationship. I needed to start the friendship. Now, it might surprise you, but I'm not naturally the most outgoing and extroverted person. Most of the time, I would much rather spend my time in the company of my books or wandering unescorted through the city, pondering the concrete and scanning the bayou's edges for signs of blue herons and wildlife. But other people contain within them possible universes that I cannot imagine. My fellow humans pull me to be my better self. And so I find that I must be brave and initiate friendships, even when I find that the act of reaching out contains within it the possibility of rejection, that it contains the possibility of making me uncomfortable or even frightened. I was rejected by my former colleague. Rejection often makes me question my self-worth. When it comes, I wonder if I am perhaps unworthy of my own self-worth. When it comes, I wonder if I am unworthy of love or friendship. But by being brave and trying again, I discover that I am. Bravery is not the only virtue we find in friendship. Generosity is there too, for friendship is the giving of the self to another. Through that giving of the self, we come to know ourselves a little better. We say, I value this part of myself enough to want to share it with someone else. Now, we could run through the list of virtues and explore how friendship offers an opportunity to practice each of them. Such an exercise, I fear, would keep us here far too long. So instead, let me underscore that our friends provide us the possibility of becoming better people. This can be true on even a trivial level. A friend visits. I take the opportunity to make a vanilla souffle, something I've never done before but will certainly do again. We delight in its silky, sweet, eggy texture. It can also be true on a substantive level. A friend calls and inspires me in my commitment to work towards justice. She reminds me that we can only build the good society together, that we can only do that by imagining the possibility of friendship between all peoples. How have your friends changed your life? Emerson and Thoreau certainly changed each other's lives. And I know that the two men, whatever their preferences for individualism, needed each other. I half suspect that Emerson's tattered memory of his friend, what was the name of my best friend, was actually an urgent cry. As Emerson disappeared into the dimming hollows of his mind, Thoreau's light was a signal that he could use to call him back to himself. I detect a similar urgency in Elizabeth Bishop's wonderful poem to Marianne Moore. We can sit down and weep. We can go shopping or play at a game of constantly being wrong with a priceless set of vocabularies. Or we can bravely deplore, but please, please come flying. Whatever was going on in Bishop's life when she wrote her friend was the most pressing matter, the strongest tug of her reality, that she see her friend. Surely it is an act of bravery to admit to such a need. Truly it is an act of generosity to wish to give oneself so fully. Let us then be brave and seek out friends. Such bravery can be as simple as saying, "Hello, I would like to get to know you." Let us be generous then and give ourselves to our friends, saying, "I have the greatest gift to offer you, myself." Doing so will help us to lead better, more virtuous lives and may draw us to unexpected places and into unexpected heights. Doing so will help us to recognize the possibility of friendship, the common humanity, the common humanness inherent in all peoples, Iranian and American, undocumented migrant and citizen. Doing so will equip us to thrive in an era of crisis and remember the promise of our faith tradition. Someday, somehow, we will all, as a human community, remember that we are all members of the great family of all souls, and so united, we shall overcome war and hatred to build the beloved community in the spirit of friendship. Let the congregation say, Amen.